Okay, let's talk about the brain and the anatomy of the brain. This particular brain belongs to Tommy. And so the part of the brain here that we see, this is referred to as the cerebrum. It has all of these folds and indentations all over it. This is, of course, the cerebellum. And we can see also the brainstem here. Let's start and focus on the cerebrum first. The cerebrum has a number of folds and indentations all over it, as we mentioned. These folds are referred to as gyri, or singular would be a gyrus. And the indentations between those gyri are referred to as sulci, or singular would be sulcus. There are a number of gyri and sulci that are important for us. The ones that we need to know for this exam is this dark gyrus here called the central sulcus. I may have said gyrus, I meant to say sulcus. This is the central sulcus. This is the precentral gyrus, and this is the postcentral gyrus. In addition, if we go internally, let me go ahead and just point out, since we're on the gyri, this is the cingulate gyrus, and right above that is the cingulate sulcus. Other things that we see on the external features of the brain are deep depressions here, deep divisions called fissures. This is the great longitudinal fissure. And over here where this middle cerebral artery is, this is known as the lateral fissure. Lateral fissure here. Now, lobes of the cerebrum correspond with the bones of the skull that protect those brain parts. So this up here is referred to as the frontal lobe, and that frontal lobe border is this central sulcus. So everything up here is frontal. Back here is parietal lobe. And if I turn this to the back side, we can see this side over here is painted blue, but this is the occipital lobe. And there's a gyrus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, known as the parieto-occipital sulcus. Over here, in yellow, is the temporal lobe. Okay. Now, if we take a transverse section or a cross section through the brain, we notice the distribution of gray matter and white matter. The white matter in the brain is located deep, and the superficial parts, especially of the cerebrum, are gray. So this represents gray matter, and this represents white matter. Okay, other things when we look at this, I should say that the brain is actually separated into a right and left cerebral hemisphere. And these two hemispheres are connected to each other by white nerve fiber tracts that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's one of those. But they are connected, these brain parts are connected, these hemispheres are connected to each other by these white tracts called commissures. And those commissures are going to allow information to pass, for example, from one side of the brain to the other. Before we look at those commissures, one other thing that I want to mention is below the temporal lobe. So if I take this and cut this off here, there's a structure here that is of significance called the insula, or the insula of Ryle. And we'll talk about that one here in a few more minutes. And we'll also come in a little deeper to that and talk about this basal nuclei that is found here. Okay, so let's talk about the mid-sagittal section here of the brain. Obviously a mid-sagittal section. So as we mentioned, this was the cerebrum, cerebellum here, and then there's the brainstem. So when we're deep within the brain, we will start talking about commissures, and we see this lots of white matter deep in the brain. And these commissures are taking information from one area of the brain to another. And so the big commissures that we notice are this one here called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Here is an anterior white commissure. Back here is the posterior white commissure. Other things that we see right here, this is known as the corpora quadrigemina, and specifically it is made of the superior and the inferior colliculus. Superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Parts here, hypothalamus And that hypothalamus is connected to this gland here known as the pituitary by a stalk called the infundibulum. That infundibulum is not shown very well in this model, but there is a stalk of tissue here called the infundibulum, which allows the hypothalamus to communicate directly with the pituitary. This is the thalamus, and in the thalamus there is an interthalamic adhesion. That is another commissure, an interthalamic adhesion. Pineal body or pineal gland here. And if I pull this back, another commissure right here is the fornix. Now, parts of the brainstem: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Cerebellum. On the cerebellum, we'll notice, to put this back together, we'll notice that the cerebellum has a right and left cerebellar hemisphere, and this lobe at the top here, these are anterior lobes, down here posterior lobes, and there is a structure between those two, between these two hemispheres called the vermis, which vermis means worm-like, and very difficult to see on this particular model. Some of them show it a little bit better, but there's a worm-like structure here called the vermis found in the cerebellum. If we take a mid-sagittal section through the cerebellum, we'll notice the distribution of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is superficial, the white matter is deep, and that white matter forms a tree-like structure, so this is called the arbor vitae. Okay. Other things that I'm going to go ahead and point out on this model, since we're seeing it at this point, is there are cavities within the brain that we're taking a mid-sagittal section and we're cutting into the cavity, so it's difficult to tell what we're looking at exactly. But I'll show you a better model of this in a second. I just want to show it the cavities as we have them here available now. So this is the lateral ventricle. The third ventricle would be right here, between these two lobes of the thalamus, right here. This is the fourth ventricle, and this little passageway is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, now what I want to do is to go internal, a little deeper, and I want to specifically take this part here, I'm going to take off this section. I want to look here, remember this was the insula. I'm going to go a little deeper, and I want to look right here at the top of this structure. This is a group of functionally related nuclei referred to as the basal nuclei. And so just to give you a reference point, this is a brainstem model, and here is the insula. So this is the same structure you're looking at here, insula virile. And I'm going to take this brainstem model, okay, I'm going to take it apart, and we're going to go and see what are referred to as basal nuclei. So I'm going to take this insula, peel this off, and I see this red structure here. This red structure represents what are referred to as the basal nuclei. In reality, it's gray, right? It's gray matter. But let me take this off, and of course this other side, under this insula, there's another one. But the basal nuclei consist of the caudate nucleus here, caudate nucleus. This, where my fingers are, that's called the lentiform nucleus. And specifically, this lateral part of the lentiform nucleus is called the putamen, and the medial part is called the globus pallidus. On the brain slides, you will note that the globus pallidus is split up into two, globus pallidus 1 and globus pallidus 2. On this model, we can only see globus pallidus. Again, this was caudate nucleus. You can remember caudate nucleus because it's the C-shaped structure. At the very end of the caudate is the amygdala. That is part of your emotional brain, the amygdala. Now, going between the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus are these gray fibers, these gray tracks right here. These are going across a structure which we can't see very well here. You can on the brain slides, but not here. And these are called the internal capsules. Well, this tissue that's going across those internal capsules is going from the caudate nucleus to the lentiform nucleus, and it's going across the internal capsule. So these structures are called the transcapsular caudatolenticular gray striae, across an internal capsule from the caudate nucleus to the lentiform nucleus is what that's referring to. So these are the basal nuclei. And again, this went in here like so. Now in addition, again, here was brain stem. This is the pons. There's the medulla oblongata. And the midbrain is up higher than that. But in addition to some of these cranial nerves I'm going to talk about in a minute, there's also cavities. And so these cavities we can see here are referred to as ventricles. And these cavities represent, these structures right here actually represent empty space. And that empty space contains a fluid. So if I were to take the brain and inject a gel into the cavities of the brain and let that gel harden, then essentially what I would have, and be careful as you take these models apart. This is a really expensive model and very easy to break, and it's all made of plastic, so I want to get these brain ventricles out. Okay. These are the brain ventricles. Again, so if I were to inject the interior part of the brain with a solidifying gel and then I take that gel out, this is what represents cavities in the brain called ventricles. So the brain ventricles include these lateral ventricles here, the third ventricle right here, fourth ventricle down here where my fingers are, fourth ventricle right here. Within the ventricles there is a tissue called choroid plexus, and that tissue is found in the lateral ventricles and a little bit in the third ventricle, and it produces and circulates the cerebrospinal fluid that's found here. So as material as the CSF is in the third ventricle, it's going to move to the third ventricle through this little foramen. Remember, this is a hole because this is a cavity. Through this little foramen called the interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen. It goes into the third ventricle. This little space right here, remember, is actually tissue. There would be tissue here because this represents a cavity. This is that interthalamic adhesion that we talked about earlier. That's what goes through there. But this is the third ventricle. Fourth ventricle down here, that CSF then moves to the fourth ventricle through this structure here called the cerebral aqueduct. Now, on the fourth ventricle, it then leaves the fourth ventricle. It either goes down here into the central canal of the spinal cord, or it comes out and goes into spaces around the brain. And so it's going to come out through these lateral apertures, sometimes called lateral foramina of Luschka, and then the median aperture, or the median foramen of Magendie. Again, these are brain ventricles. Here's another model of the brain ventricles. Lateral ventricles, third ventricle here. You can see choroid plexus painted in pink. That represents choroid plexus. You can see where the epiderma is located, where those cells are that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. Fourth ventricle here, cerebral aqueduct there. Interventricular foramen here. Median aperture and lateral apertures.